Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR adventure into the fascinating history of the jigsaw puzzle. Jigsaws were invented in the 18th century, but they have their origins in much older puzzles and art forms. And in spite of, or perhaps because of their low-tech appeal, they remain a highly popular pastime. So in this talk, we're going to look at the origins of the jigsaw. We'll discover how it was first developed as an educational tool and delve into the mystery of who actually invented it. We'll see how it later became a mass-marketed leisure activity. And we'll also look at the psychological significance of the jigsaw and discuss some of the potential reasons for its enduring popularity. As usual, there'll be a selection of slideshow images to accompany our topic, and several of these are photographs of puzzles from the collection of Joe Seymour. Joe is an expert puzzle collector and maker, and he owns an incredible treasury of jigsaws, including some really rare and antique pieces, which you can see if you visit his website at icollectpuzzles.com. I'll put a link in the description below the video, so you can go and see Joe's collection for yourself. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank him for his help in letting me use images from his amazing collection. Of course, if you don't want to look at the pictures on the slideshow, that's okay too. You can always come back to them later on, so that right now you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the intriguing history of the jigsaw puzzle. Jigsaws are, in essence, a form of dissected puzzle, which means that they are cut up into small pieces, and then the challenge is to reassemble all the pieces in the right order. However, jigsaws are specifically pictorial dissected puzzles, which means that when you put the pieces back together they form a picture. And they didn't really come into existence until around the 1760s. However, other types of dissected puzzle that aren't specifically pictorial had existed a long time before that. One of the earliest ones that we know about is called the Archimedes box, or stomachion, and it consists of a plain square that has been dissected into 14 pieces. The puzzle was supposedly invented by the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, but whether he actually did invent it or not, I don't really know. He was definitely the first person to write a mathematical treatise about it, and because of that, we know that this puzzle dates back more than 2,000 years. The interesting thing about the Archimedes box is that, unlike a jigsaw, there are several different thousand ways of solving it, which you think would make it a fairly easy puzzle to do, but in fact it's surprisingly difficult. Another early forerunner of the jigsaw is the mosaic, which isn't a puzzle but an art form. As I'm sure you know, mosaics are made up from hundreds of tiny individual elements, such as pieces of stone, glass, shell, or ceramic, that are then arranged together to create a design or picture. The earliest mosaics that we currently know about come from the ancient world of Mesopotamia, and they're more than 3,000 years old. But it was the Greeks and Romans who elevated the mosaic into a figurative art form, and they used it to create breathtakingly beautiful and complex pictures from thousands of tiny, individually coloured pieces. Given that it's a picture that's made up from many small parts, it's easy to see how the mosaic is another ancestor of the jigsaw. However, mosaics are works of art that are created from scratch, whereas a jigsaw is a puzzle that takes an existing picture and deliberately dissects it into pieces to be rebuilt. So it's not until you combine these two distinct strands of, on the one hand, the mosaic, and on the other hand, a dissected puzzle like the Archimedes box, that you actually get a pictorial dissected puzzle, or jigsaw. It wasn't until the 18th century that somebody had the bright idea to combine these two elements, and quite who it was who first had the idea of making a dissected pictorial puzzle is a subject that's still surrounded in mystery to this day. The person who is usually credited with inventing the jigsaw is an Englishman called John Spilsbury, who was a cartographer and engraver, born in 1739. He was certainly marketing himself as a map dissector by 1763, and today he's very much the public face of jigsaw invention. However, it's entirely possible that Spilsbury received the idea for making pictorial dissected puzzles from somebody else. The earliest jigsaws, including Spilsbury's, are all dissected maps that were created to teach geography to children. And there were map makers in Germany, France, and the Netherlands at the time who might all potentially have a claim to being the inventor of the jigsaw. This is because dissected maps have been found that have dates on them prior to 1763. However, these dates are a little bit misleading because once the fashion for dissected maps took off, lots of cartographers actually used up their old, outdated and unsold map stock by cutting them up and turning them into puzzles. So a dissected map from this period might have a date on it that refers to when the map was made, rather than the jigsaw. It's also entirely possible that the original idea for the jigsaw didn't originate with a map maker at all, but rather was invented by someone who was responsible for the education of children. In 2007, the auction house Christie's put up for sale an elegant little mahogany cabinet, which was known as Lady Finch's Puzzle Cabinet, and which contained several early examples of dissected maps. Lady Finch was a governess to the children of the British King George III, and she used the maps to teach geography to her royal charges. Upon her death, her cabinet was inherited by her sister, Lady Penn, and it was then passed down through successive generations of her family, right up until the time it was sold in 2007. When the cabinet came up for auction, it was found to contain an early, handwritten note that was pinned to the inside of one door and read, "Cabinet belonging to Lady Charlotte Finch, sister to Lady Juliana Penn, governess to the children of George III. She was the inventor of dissecting maps, and those in this cabinet were expressly made for, and always used in teaching geography to, George IV, his brothers and sisters." Whilst the veracity of this note can't be proved, it does suggest that even if Lady Finch wasn't the actual inventor of the jigsaw, she probably had a hand in its early development. It's also interesting to note that John Spilsbury himself served as an apprentice to Thomas Jeffreys, who was the royal cartographer to George III at the very same time that Lady Finch was teaching the royal children. So if she had asked the royal map maker to create a series of dissected maps for her schoolroom, it's entirely possible that the young apprentice John Spilsbury would have worked on them, and this possibly is where he found the inspiration for his own subsequent career as a puzzle maker. Another strong contender for the title of inventor of the jigsaw is a friend of Lady Finch's, Madame Le Prince de Beaumont. Madame Le Prince de Beaumont was a prolific French author and educator who moved to London in 1748 and who subsequently developed a huge influence over British educational practices through her magasins, or instructional handbooks, which she wrote to help parents with the education of their children. Madame Le Prince de Beaumont understood the importance of engaging a child's imagination and sense of fun during lessons, and she was a pioneer of using games, role plays, and stories in the classroom to make learning more fun and interactive. During the time of Spilsbury's apprenticeship, she's also known to have placed an order with the royal cartographer for a set of what she refers to as wooden maps. She doesn't specifically refer to them as dissected maps, but the very fact that she was ordering them to be made out of wood, which is a far more robust material, implies, I think, that she was not requesting the usual teaching maps. Given her innovative educational ideas and her ability to invent new ways of teaching, it seems to me highly likely that Madame le Prince de Beaumont was the first person to come up with the idea for the jigsaw. I can also imagine that she shared her idea with her friend, Lady Finch, who adopted it as a means of teaching the royal children, and that John Spilsbury, through his apprentice work, came across the idea and later marketed it for himself. All of this is conjecture, of course. It's possible that we'll never know for certain who it was who first invented the dissected map jigsaw. However, one further piece of evidence that Madame le Prince de Beaumont was the originator comes in a letter that was written in 1762 by Baroness Holland to her sister, in which she enthuses about the wonders of teaching her son via Beaumont's dissected maps. This implies to me that Beaumont was the inventor, and it makes sense that such a pioneering educational puzzle would have been originally thought up by someone who was a pioneer of children's education. Nevertheless, John Spilsbury continues to receive widespread credit for the invention of the jigsaw, and he was certainly the first person to market them for sale to the general public. A fashion for teaching via dissected maps soon took off, and Spilsbury was joined by a number of other puzzle makers, including John Betts, John and Edward Wallace, and William Darton. Darton was another jigsaw innovator in his own way, because he was one of the earliest puzzle makers to branch out from making dissected maps and expand into other puzzle subjects as well. In his collection, Joe Seymour, in fact, has a wonderful early William Darton puzzle that was published in 1787 and which is entitled Engravings for Teaching the Elements of English History. It's a beautiful black and white jigsaw that's made up of medallion portrait engravings of the kings and queens of England, with short descriptions of their reigns written around the outside of each portrait. Darton's history puzzle, and others like it, led to an expansion of dissected puzzle themes, as makers realised that all sorts of pictures could be pasted onto wood and then sawn up to make a puzzle. By the beginning of the 19th century, however, the jigsaw was being slightly eclipsed by another type of pictorial dissected puzzle, the picture block. Picture blocks take a slightly different form to a jigsaw because each of the pieces is made up of a regular six-sided cube, and this means that a different picture can be pasted onto each side of the block. Being able to combine 6 different pictures in one puzzle in this way made picture blocks very economical, and they soon became a popular alternative to flat, dissected jigsaw puzzles, which in their early days tended to be made up of very few pieces and were much simpler to do. That state of affairs changed as the 19th century wore on, and the Industrial Revolution brought in new advances in technology that completely transformed the way jigsaws were made. In 1865, a patent was issued in America for the very first treadle-operated fret saw, and these treadle-operated tools helped to mechanize and speed up the jigsaw cutting process. The pieces no longer had to be cut by hand, and this meant that much smaller and far more intricate puzzle pieces could be cut. By the end of the 19th century, treadle-operated fret saws were in widespread use, and consequently jigsaws had become far more complex, and therefore far more satisfying, puzzles to solve. As they became more complex, they overtook puzzle blocks completely, which were relegated to the nurseries of only very young children. And the jigsaw became the dissected puzzle of choice for older children who relished the fun of solving a more challenging puzzle. It was also becoming clear, by the beginning of the 20th century, that there was potential for an adult puzzle market, and this led to an expansion in the type of pictures that were used to make jigsaws. Up until this point, jigsaw makers had aimed their products very squarely at children, and so the subjects they used were usually either educational, or they featured fanciful or sentimental images, such as scenes of sweet kittens, childhood friendships, or figures from fairy and folk tales. However, the possibilities for adult jigsaws made manufacturers look about for pictures that reflected a more adult market, and so by the early 1900s, we start to find jigsaws that depict scenes of lovely landscapes, exotic travel, beautiful architecture, or even the latest fashions. One particular range of jigsaws that did a brilliant job of capturing this aspirational element of the new adult market for puzzles was the Pastime brand. This was made by the American company Parker Brothers, and there were 3 Parker brothers, George, Charles and Edward, who had originally formed their company in 1883 to manufacture playing cards and tabletop games. One of their early successes, in fact, was the legendary, or notorious, depending on how you feel about it, board game of Monopoly. But in the early years of their business, they hadn't really focused on jigsaws at all. They'd produced a very simple and limited range for children, and it wasn't until 1908 that the brothers realised that there might be a potential jigsaw market for their parents too. So they launched the Pastime brand, and it consisted of a range of puzzles that featured high-quality illustrations, bright, attractive colours, and novelty pieces that were cut to resemble either letters, numbers, or the silhouettes of recognisable shapes, such as birds, flowers, or common objects. The range proved to be wildly popular, to the extent that by 1909, just 1 year after launch, the Parker brothers had to rent an additional building to accommodate all the new puzzle cutters they'd employed to work on their Pastime range, and they were turning out 15,000 puzzles per week. Other manufacturers were also doing their bit to capitalise on the sudden new popularity of jigsaws, and consequently the beginning of the 20th century saw the first jigsaw boom. It was intensified further by the invention of interlocking pieces, which are still used today and have those distinctive curved tabs or lugs with corresponding sockets or slots that make the jigsaw pieces easier to fit together and harder to accidentally obliterate if you happen to jolt the table that you're working on. The jigsaw craze of the 1900s was also perhaps partly driven by the fact that, as these were the days before cinema and radio had really taken off, and television was yet to be invented, people were looking for leisure activities that they could do at home. In this respect, a jigsaw had many advantages. It could be enjoyed as a solitary activity, or turned into a communal family game. It had no complicated rules to learn, which meant that even the youngest members of the family could participate. It didn't require too much space to set up, and it was also a relatively cheap way to provide oneself or one's family with hours of simple diversion. As technology progressed and those new innovations of cinema and radio became more accessible to the average household, the fashion for jigsaw puzzles began to wane. However, a second boom occurred in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, a time when, as I'm sure you know, millions of people in both America and Europe lost their jobs and were living in abject poverty. By this time, mass-produced jigsaws were being made out of cardboard, and this meant that they were cheap to produce and were an accessible form of entertainment that could be used as a welcome distraction at a time when millions of people were suffering very acutely. In 1932, the University Distributing Company even came up with Jig of the Week, and these were small, simple puzzles that were released on a weekly basis and sold for just 25 cents. These jigsaws became a really effective temporary distraction from people who were suffering untold daily stresses. And unsurprisingly perhaps, when the Second World War broke out in 1939, jigsaws continued to remain popular as a way of distracting people from the chaos and violence that was going on around them and providing them with a few hours of welcome escapism. However, once the Second World War was over and austerity was gradually replaced with a new era of growing consumerism, jigsaws once again fell out of favour. They were considered to be rather old-fashioned, in an era when increasing technology and increasing shopping options had created a plethora of ever more sophisticated entertainment options. The jigsaw market was once again mainly redirected towards children, although the popularity of adult jigsaws remained with the generation of adults who themselves had been children during the 1930s and 1940s, and who still retained a fondness for the pastime of their youth. Perhaps this is why so many of us who were born in the later decades of the 20th century associate jigsaws with grandparents or with other elderly friends and relations who would be visited at Christmas and who would get out a jigsaw which everyone could gather around and solve together. Certainly for many of my generation, I think jigsaws today retain a nostalgic appeal. There's something very pleasingly old-fashioned about doing one, and the fact that they are so low-tech has ironically started to make them a popular entertainment choice once again. In an era when so many of our contemporary entertainment choices come to us via digital screens, jigsaws provide a welcome opportunity to literally switch off and indulge in a more basic and more tactile pastime. Jigsaws are also a wonderful way of spending a few hours of leisure time if you find yourself confined to quarters. And of course, I'm recording this talk in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic has led to many of us having to go into lockdown and stay indoors. It's perhaps not surprising to discover that during this year, sales of jigsaws have rocketed, as once again people turn to them as a relaxing diversion during a time of stress and uncertainty. However, according to puzzle expert Joe Seymour, jigsaws were already becoming fashionable again, even before the pandemic started. While the shelter-in-place advice caused a jump in sales, he says, I don't really think it impacted on the popularity of the jigsaw. Prior to the virus, you could find puzzles for sale everywhere. They are in drugstores, department stores, grocery stores, toy stores, and I have even seen them in convenience stores and gas stations. Jigsaws are in fact so popular at the present time that there are even several dedicated jigsaw shops that sell nothing but puzzles. You can buy tiny micro-puzzles that come in test tubes, or complex 3D puzzles that result in impressive built models. Solving a puzzle is a very satisfying occupation. It creates a sense of purpose and achievement that might be minor and temporary, but can nevertheless be helpful to a mind that is otherwise feeling overwhelmed by the world at large. There's also a meditative quality to jigsaws, I think, that ties in very well with society's current interest in mindfulness. Working on a puzzle encourages us to stay in the present moment. It engages several of our senses at once It quiets the background chatter in our brains, and it induces a sense of calm and order that can be highly beneficial. Modern jigsaws are also often things of great beauty. Digital printing has led to a significant rise in quality, and the depth of colour and beautiful designs that are available now only adds to the pleasure of solving them. Sitting down to solve a puzzle, and in the process, literally building a beautiful picture, is an enduring pleasure, I think. It's a direct and simple pleasure, but perhaps it's the simplicity of the jigsaw that's the key to its lasting potency as a pastime. And why, more than 250 years after its invention, a jigsaw still has the power to distract and delight us. This brings me to the end of my History of the Jigsaw talk, and I do hope you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating topic with me. I hope too that you can join me again soon for another ASMR adventure. And until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.